The ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife where the souls of the deceased would live on in the same way they had lived on earth. To prepare for this afterlife, they engaged in a complex set of funerary practices and rituals that aimed to ensure that the deceased would be properly cared for and protected in the next world. One of the most famous figures of ancient Egypt was Ramses, and his afterlife beliefs and rituals provide insight into the complexity of these practices. Ramses was one of the most powerful pharaohs in ancient Egypt, and he is known for his great military conquests, his building projects, and his role in expanding the empire. In death, he was no less important, and his tomb and funerary practices reflect the significance that the ancient Egyptians placed on the afterlife. One of the key elements of the afterlife beliefs of the ancient Egyptians was the concept of the Ba and the Ka. The Ba was the personality of the deceased, while the Ka was the vital force that gave the Ba its life. The ancient Egyptians believed that if the Ka and the Ba were not properly preserved, the deceased would be unable to function in the afterlife. To ensure that the Ka and the Ba were properly preserved, the ancient Egyptians engaged in a complex set of rituals and practices. The first step in preparing for the afterlife was the embalming of the body. The ancient Egyptians believed that the body needed to be preserved in order for the Ka and Ba to continue to inhabit it in the afterlife. The embalming process involved the removal of the internal organs, which were then placed in canopic jars, and the application of preservative oils and resins to the body. The body was then wrapped in linen bandages, and a mask was placed over the face. Once the body was prepared, it was placed in a coffin and taken to the tomb. The tomb was a complex structure that was designed to protect the deceased and provide them with everything they would need in the afterlife. The tomb was typically divided into two parts, the burial chamber and the offerings chapel. The burial chamber was where the body was placed, and it was typically filled with a variety of objects that the deceased would need in the afterlife. These objects included furniture, clothing, jewelry, and food. The offerings chapel was where the living would bring offerings to the deceased, typically in the form of food, drink, and other goods. One of the most important aspects of the afterlife beliefs of the ancient Egyptians was the role of the gods. The ancient Egyptians believed that the gods played a vital role in the afterlife, and they engaged in a variety of rituals and practices designed to appease the gods and ensure their favor in the afterlife. One of the most famous of these rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ceremony involved the use of a special tool, typically made of gold or silver, to open the mouth of the deceased. The opening of the mouth was believed to allow the Ka and Ba to enter and exit the body, and it was a crucial step in ensuring that the deceased would be able to function in the afterlife. Another important aspect of the afterlife beliefs of the ancient Egyptians was the role of magic. The ancient Egyptians believed that magic could be used to protect the deceased and ensure their well-being in the afterlife. This magic was typically performed by priests and other experts, who used spells and incantations to protect the deceased from harm and ensure their survival in the afterlife. The afterlife beliefs and rituals of Ramses provide insight into the complexity of the funerary practices of ancient Egypt. Ramses' tomb and burial chamber were filled with a variety of objects that he would need in the afterlife, including furniture, clothing, jewelry, and food. These objects were believed to be necessary for Ramses' survival in the afterlife, and they were carefully selected and prepared. One of the most significant objects in Ramses' tomb was his sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was a large, elaborate container that was designed to hold the mummified body of the deceased. Ramses' sarcophagus was made of red granite and was adorned with intricate carvings and hieroglyphs. The lid of the sarcophagus was carved in the likeness of Ramses, with his arms crossed over his chest. Another important object in Ramses' tomb was his canopic jars. These jars were used to hold the internal organs that had been removed during the embalming process. Ramses' canopic jars were made of alabaster and were carved in the likeness of four of the gods of ancient Egypt: Imsidi, Hapi, Dumutef, and Kabasanuf. In addition to these objects, Ramses' tomb also contained a variety of other items that were intended to provide him with comfort and protection in the afterlife. These included clothing, jewelry, furniture, and food. Ramses was buried with a large collection of gold and silver jewelry, including necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. He was also buried with several pieces of furniture, including a bed and a throne. Food was also an important part of the funerary practices of ancient Egypt, and Ramses was buried with a variety of foods that he would need in the afterlife. These included bread, beer, wine, and meat. The food was typically placed in small containers or vessels, which were then placed in the tomb with the deceased. Overall, the afterlife beliefs and rituals of Ramses provide a fascinating glimpse into the complexity and significance of the funerary practices of ancient Egypt. Ramses' tomb and burial chamber were filled with objects that were carefully selected and prepared, with the intention of providing him with everything he would need in the afterlife. These objects were believed to be necessary for his survival and protection in the next world, and they were an essential part of the afterlife beliefs and practices of the ancient Egyptians.